Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thanks, Jason. Good to be with you.
So, Chuck, you were a SEAL team leader in the Navy's SEAL Team 6. And so there is a lot going on. Where should we start?
Well, we could always start in Kherson, where the Russians are planning a big move, and I actually wish they would try it. A force of approximately 10,000 troops, which is half a division. That number has been reported also as high as 20,000, and a force of, I'll let everybody do the math, 300 boats. These are recreational boats, pontoon boats, speed boats that were in people's garages adjacent to the river. And the Kremlin would like a cross-river assault onto Kherson or north into Kherson Oblast. Not only is this a very, very bad idea, and I encourage the Russians to undertake it as soon as they possibly can, but there have been mutinies and resistance from even the high command, who are saying this is a very inauspicious operation. The thing that is fascinating about this is Ukrainian drones have detected an epidemic of suicide among the Russian forces stationed on the river. As many as 200 or 300 of them have been videotaped killing themselves. That tells me that the situation there is egregious in terms of the condition of the troops, their material states of readiness, but let's call it like we see it, their morale. So for all intents and purposes, that Russian force on the south of the river has been defeated, and that's a morale problem.
So we see problems there with morale, and it seems though it's not only there. It hits across the board. Perhaps systemically it's bad. Have you seen any other signs of that?
Yeah, it's, for example, there is one point of contact for every 6 kilometers throughout the entire zero line. Now, in places like Kursk, Kupiansk, Kurakhove, these attacks are slightly more dense. But in any attack, the Russians lose somewhere between 25 and 80% of their assault force, with 50% being the median number. So every time they attack, they lose at least 50% of the attack force. Okay, those are sort of the median mode numbers, right? But the statistics are truly egregious. When the Russians try to use a larger force, as they did 2 months ago in Kupiansk, they launched a battalion-sized attack, 40 vehicles, 900 troops. They were wiped out in 22 minutes. Okay, by any measure, the efficacy of the Russian armed forces, it's abysmal. This is bad leadership, bad material readiness, bad tactics, bad training. And I'll also point this out. Almost every one of those attacks occur in broad daylight, where they fail instantly. They are swarmed by drones, first-person attack drones, and they are swarmed by drones that direct in artillery strikes. So this isn't what winning looks like.
So the Russian military itself has got a lot of problems, not just with the fact that they're losing a war in Ukraine, but it doesn't seem that there's really a plan to win the war in Ukraine, even if they wanted to. And as you said, the military leadership itself is one of the main reasons that that is the case. But what is the problem with Russia's military leadership? Why doesn't it function correctly?
Well, Putin doesn't have a problem with poor military leadership. It's his legacy. So for 25 years, which is 2 generations of officers, a generation of officers generally 10 years, everyone who's come up to the top in his armed forces, they've been in on the grift. They're in on the bribes, the diversion of materials, etc. They concentrate so much on that there are no warrior scholars who are the general officers in NATO armies. Most admirals and generals in the United States have a PhD. You know, every officer above the rank of captain, if you want your career to blossom in a NATO army, you have a master's degree. This is a profession, right? So the things that are going on in the Russian army right now, Russia has lost this war. Sure, they're still fighting, and sure, they're still making gains, in air quotes. We'll talk about what their gains are, but Russia is not capable of conducting the large-scale ground maneuver warfare operations that could win this war, right? There is no army group south that's going to push into Ukraine and meet up on the banks of the Dnipro. It's not going to happen, Jason. They don't have a plan, and they don't have the means to carry that out anymore. You know, in that effect, the war is over. It's not a win. It's a quagmire right now.
So, what though do they hope to gain with these meat assaults? We've seen that the Russian military is making very few gains, though they claim that they're having great success. First, what do you think about those supposed gains? And secondly, what is the strategy of losing so many lives just to take rural areas or farmland? Where does this go? What are they thinking that they're doing?
Well, I don't know what they think they're doing, but here's the measure of what they're doing. They lost more men this year than the United States lost in 4 years of global warfare in World War II. So they lost 48,000 people in 2024, and they made some gains. They gained less territory than Los Angeles County, California. That's not what winning looks like. Okay, of that 48,000 people that they lost in 2024, they've lost 780,000, more than the Germans lost in Stalingrad. They're getting defeated. And again, just to point out, the way to win this war is to have generals like Patton, like Rommel, generals who can command mechanized infantry divisions in association with combined arms operations and gobble up large portions of land. Is that going to happen? Russia lost approximately 75,000 people trying to take Bakhmut, which they did take after turning it into a moonscape. They still haven't reached Chasiv Yar, which is 4 kilometers to the west. They're incapable of doing that. All these local commanders do every day is report, I've launched 25 attacks. That's it. They don't care. And we've seen those attacks generally lose at least 50% of their participants, and they're not gaining terrain.
Russian soldiers themselves obviously see that they're not making a lot of gains, and they see that they're just being thrown out to the front. They're cannon fodder, and they're just dying. So it goes back to what you said earlier. There is a serious problem with the sense within the Russian military of how things are going, and morale has been affected. So if you look at that historically, what does that mean for the future of the Russian army? What does that mean of how it will change the course of the war one way or the other?
Well, we only need to look to Russian history, although examples throughout military history completely align with this. Russia's operations in its Western Front, the Eastern Front of World War I, Russian soldiers were in this same conundrum. They had poorly trained generals, inept tactics, poor material readiness. The average Russian soldier saw abundant evidence every day to prove to him that his life was worth nothing to his commander. So the most valuable resource that a general officer has entrusted to his care by his nation are the troops he commands. But in the Russian army, troops are expendable. They are a commodity. They are like a liter of gasoline. So the average private serving in Ukraine, he knows exactly how the war is going, precisely how it is going. The Russian army is hollowing itself out in Ukraine. Now, you can take an army with poor morale and As long as you keep it static, it will continue to eat its own intestines out and get weaker and weaker, but it may not collapse of its own. It will eventually, but how that army will totally fly to pieces if it is stressed, if it is hit, if it is attacked. The easiest thing to do is attack every day. That's easy. The hardest thing to do is sustain an attack, get knocked on your butt, get up and fight. The Russians can't do that anymore. You strike them a hard blow and they're going to fall. They're going to fall apart.
So it definitely seems that they could fall apart. And it is sort of interesting. When we think of recent experiences within Russia, where there's been someone going against the grain, let's say, for instance, Prigozhin, just a couple years ago, rolled into Rostov. And what happened there when the leader of the Wagner group showed up? Well, first, we saw that the citizens themselves came out and greeted him. They brought him food and water, and they greeted his soldiers as champions. But even more important, I think, is that the senior Russian military leadership that came out to chat with him, well, the fact is they came out to chat with him. They did not call an airstrike when they knew that he was just 20 kilometers down the road. We saw that the head of the Chechens, though he was only 100 kilometers away, took more than 6 hours and never arrived. We saw that the Russian military was unwilling to confront him. And I interpret that as being a sign that they simply weren't sure what would happen next. I mean, if the guy's going to become the next leader of Russia, do you really want to start a fight with him? It's better just to stand by the sidelines. In the end, it wasn't the military that stopped him. So if we look at that and we look at another example, Kursk, Russia, when the Ukrainians launched the invasion, you would imagine there would be this intense outpouring of support. So for instance, in the case of Ukraine, when it was invaded, thousands upon thousands of men took to the streets and requested ammunition as well as firearms so they could defend their homes from the Russians. But we didn't see that in Kursk. We saw that the Russians, the civilians, fled, and the Russian military, hundreds upon hundreds of them surrendered because they had not anticipated this invasion. So if we look at that, it would seem that both the military as well as the civilians aren't very willing to stick it out and put their necks on the line in order to defend the Putin regime. How do you see it?
Well, during the mutiny, you and I wrote extensively. I mean, we were almost doing play by play, but one of the things we pointed out was during Prigozhin's run to Rostov, nobody stopped him. Then he turned and he started to Moscow. He passed hundreds of military checkpoints where no one even asked to see his proof of insurance. He just kept going, shooting down airplanes as he went. And remember, it was very likely, you and I assessed, this negotiation with Putin. Like, okay, I got your message. Everything's cool, little buddy. We knew what was going to happen, but Prigozhin, with his 8th grade education, did not. But you called it specifically at that point. Look, nobody was in it with Putin. They're just not. The other thing, and we wrote another piece called Prigozhin's Gift, it forced Putin to embrace Gerasimov and Shoigu, who were the authors of this failed war in Ukraine. Now the situation has gotten so bad, Gerasimov and Shoigu are God knows where, and who knows what information Putin is getting from the front. But you and I both know, we were speaking before we went on, he isn't getting the truth, right? He is getting flattery. He is getting rosy reports. He is getting, we captured Vuhledar, right? They did after 10 years. And guess how many roads go into Vuhledar? One. And then you've got to turn around and go back down the same road. Again, that isn't winning. They are capturing terrain that doesn't even have utilities. These are farm fields that are littered with tens of thousands of landmines, most of them Russian. So when you see a vehicle hit a mine, a Russian vehicle in a video, there's about a 30% chance it's run over one of its own mines. It's unwinnable now, Jason. It's still going to go on, but it is unwinnable. And we weren't wrong 3 years ago, and we're not wrong now.
Absolutely. I think that the Russian military is just in dire straits. And a lot of people say, but you've been seeing it for a long time. It's going to break. I think that we have to understand this as a continuum. Like all things in history, it's either in the decline or in the ascendancy. All countries cease to exist at some point. So, Russia or its military, is it rising? Is it becoming greater by the day? Or is it on the hill downwards? Is it headed towards eventual collapse? And I think that there is no sign whatsoever that it's becoming stronger. In fact, it looks like it is simply getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And when the final moment comes, when there's a great jolt of some sort or some sort of a strong strike on it, it could just shatter. And so let's talk about that. Historically, militaries, what does it look like when a military starts to just break apart or fall apart or just get smashed?
Well, in Russia's own history, we look back to the 1917, 1918 period where the Russian army on its Western Front collapsed, and within a month, the Tsar was deposed and the communists were in charge. Defeat in Russia is the handmaiden of political change. When you're looking at a dictatorship that's been in power for 25 years, for example, the Assad dynasty, it looks completely monolithic. It looks completely in control until the second it's not, right? What examples do we have of that? Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, little buddy Assad, and I hate to say it, Vladimir Putin, you as well. Wars are in the ascendancy and the descendancy. Insurgencies smolder forever, but governments collapse. And we will eventually see, we are not going to see a peaceful transition of power in Moscow. That is not going to happen. And there are economic factors that are certainly in the cards right now, and they are going to have a highly negative effect on Russian political stability.
Surely, the Russian economy has got very significant problems. In fact, though they publicly claim that their inflation rate's about 9%, others have estimated, such as Dr. Hankey at Johns Hopkins University, that the real inflation rate is about 27%. Now, keep in mind, the key interest rate set by the central bank is 21%. So why that's interesting? Well, they actually have to keep increasing the key interest rate to try to control inflation. But because nobody likes to pay more interest and it hurts, what we see is that the government is pushing back on the central bank, which should be independent. And in fact, they want to fire the president of the central bank. And if they fire her and they just, let's say, remove the key interest rate and it's no longer 21%, they dropped it 4% like they want to do, we'll see just runaway inflation. But on the other side of things, we see this devaluation in the midst. Why is that? Well, the Russian federal budget is based and calculated on having oil sell for about $72 per barrel. But if the US starts producing large amounts of oil and starts to remove some of the sanctions on Venezuela as part of an anticipated negotiations with the dictator there, what would that mean? Well, some Russian economists, such as Igor Lepshitz, has estimated that the ruble would have to be devalued from its current value of about $1 equaling 110 rubles to maybe needing to devalue to $1 equaling 135 or even 155 rubles. So imagine you're the average Russian. So you have a salary, but you're seeing your salary eating up 27% on one side from inflation, and another, let's say 35 or 40% due to devaluation. How do you survive? And we see that there's already shortages of various foodstuffs, such as butter, but there's also just skyrocketing prices. Recently, it was observed that if you wish to buy cucumbers in some stores in Russia, how expensive have they become? Well, you're looking at about $7.50 for 1 kilogram. To put that in other terms, 60 kilograms of cucumbers is more than what half the Russian population makes per month. So just think of this: cucumbers, a very basic foodstuff, low manufacturing cost, and yet the price is becoming unattainable for many people. We see that bread factories are going out of business. We see that they can no longer produce enough bread. We see that there's shortages of a mountain of things, and it's all related to economic factors. the Russian economy is simply not sustainable. It cannot continue like this forever. And the good part, there's nowhere that Russia could turn. China had always been their great hope, but China itself has significant economic problems. It has a massive housing budget, and we see the youth unemployment rate, for instance, is about 18% today. That's staggering. So China is surely not going to be coming to hand out money to Russia. So Putin himself, rather than do what would be necessary to fix the economy, which is allow the central bank to operate independently to increase the interest rates, which would be painful, he's not willing to do that. And he's so detached from the reality that it's necessary even that he's probably going to act politically, which will just worsen inflation. But the key thing, and what we're on the verge of seeing, which is great, is that there is a huge bubble that's been created with mortgages. And it affects more than 40% of banks, that they would probably go bust once people start to go bust on their mortgages. Keep in mind, people were getting government subsidized mortgages that were an interest rate of, let's say, 7%. Well, that interest rate today is 20 something percent, and real estate prices are collapsing. So overall, people will not be able to pay back their mortgages. And the banks affected, a staggering number of them, will go bust, requiring the government then to bail them out. And if they're bailed out, that just makes inflation worse and worse and worse. And despite the fact that Russia claims that it's doing great economically, let's look at the military expenditures. Yes, it's been a massive increase recently, but we have to understand it's only about the rate of inflation. And even there, they still can't use the money effectively because there's such a lack of goods in their own markets. So I think that the Russian economy really could just collapse. It could just fall apart. If that were to happen, the war could end dramatically and very quickly because there's simply no longer an ability to convince soldiers to stay on the front for a salary that's disappeared due to inflation. And who would want to join that sort of a military? And how would the government itself even be able to buy the diesel necessary to keep the military working? There is a lot of signs that economically Russia is in an untenable position and it could fall apart. So where do you think that the role of the economy fits into what we see in the war?
Well, without an economic engine, there can be no war. And without equipment, there can be no war. Russia, unfortunately, entered into the first 21st century war with the greatest plan they had from 1983. 1,000 days ago, first-person drones were not a viable anti-armor weapon. 1,000 years ago, unmanned naval drones had no chance of defeating a large surface force in naval warfare, right? 1,000 days ago, there wasn't an unmanned naval vessel that has ever shot down a helicopter. Ukraine's economy is doing pretty well, all things considered, and in terms of its technological innovation, its tactical innovation, the fact that it is lucky to be fighting now essentially on the defensive, meaning that if for the war to go on, Russia has to sustain the costs, the planning, the expenditure and material in attacking constantly. And this plays in to what I see as one of the military strategic goals of this war, and that is for Ukraine to destroy the Russian army, right? To make sure that Putin, at the end of this war, whether it is next year, 3 years, which is what I'm still going for, but at the end of that period, there is no Russian army, right? He won't have a force to try this again or to try it on in Lithuania, in Estonia, or Latvia. So I'm very glad you got to tour the economic front because that is it in warfare. You don't have a strong economy, you're not going to have a strong military. And Russia, face it, is running out of everything. They're burning through their tanks. If they send a tank to the front, you're lucky if you get a T-62, right? A tank that President Kennedy worried about. You might get a T-55, a song that Elvis was worried about when he was stationed in Germany. You can see where this is going. They have to depend on North Korea for ballistic missiles. And the good thing about North Korean ballistic missiles is they're made in North Korea. They land, in some cases, hundreds of kilometers away from where they're supposed to be fired. They've brought in North Korean shock troops. Well, 50,000 troops were devoted by Russia to take back the Kursk salient. 38,000 of them are dead now since August. That's not what winning looks like, Jason.
So it does seem that it's going very bad for Russia across the battlefield. However, internationally, I don't know if we could argue that Russia is doing so badly. It seems that their hybrid war is working out quite well for them. What do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of gray zone operations, in terms of a persistent campaign of sabotage, assassinations, you know, this isn't conjecture. These are activities that they have been caught red-handed in. The West has already exchanged a number of Russian assassins. We see ongoing attempts at sabotage and very sophisticated attempts at sabotage, direct action. We also see these gray zone operations. For example, the Eagle S, which dragged its cable, its anchor across fouling cables in the Baltic, which, by the way, is the fourth time that has happened, not the first or the second. Interestingly, the Finns, God bless them, they launched a naval special warfare operation and seized the ship. So they weren't going to interview the crew and let it go on its way. I'm looking at you, Sweden. But I think the biggest threat to worldwide stability and the perception of this war is the highly effective nature of Russian information warfare. And you and I were just talking about, again, a network has been discovered in Latin America. I was amazed at the number of outlets, how interconnected they are, and how they are building information specifically for Latin markets. And that influences the world's perception of how the war is going.
Absolutely the case. In fact, it is pretty amazing. When you look at the effect that Russia has in Latin America, Africa, and other places where we see people publicly supporting Russia, they truly believe that Russia is doing something positive. It's liberating Ukraine, and they really believe it. And it's actually sort of amazing. I've spent a lot of time myself in Latin America, and I've talked with a lot of political leaders over the years. And it surprised me how often Russia Today, for instance, has been cited as a primary source in making an argument. And nobody was surprised by it. It's the most natural thing in the world. The same as if somebody had said the New York Times, why not also cite Russia Today? So if it's considered to be credible, that's quite worrisome. But it's not just that. The information space is clear. They definitely try to cover it with their propaganda, and it is manipulating populations. So much so, just in the last few years, as we've discussed before, we've seen in Africa that Russia has successfully toppled a number of governments there, such as in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, where it had worked with the coup plotters just weeks or months before they went back home and overthrew the governments. So we see that Russia is effective in this hybrid warfare. It's not all about the war in Ukraine, which I would argue is how Vladimir Putin views the war in Ukraine is rather just a battle in a global war which he's fighting. And the information space is key. We saw that just recently, they tried to steal the elections in Romania. And in fact, the unknown presidential candidate came in second place in the first round. However, the courts then threw out those election results. We saw in Moldova, just barely, the pro-European political candidates came to power and the pro-EU referendum passed. But that was despite the fact that Russia did its best to try to influence the outcome of the elections there. In the case of Georgia, now, weeks after the elections, protests are ongoing against the pro-Russian government there. But in all these cases, Russia's made a calculation. It's simply much cheaper to finance propaganda, disinformation, and elections to just manipulate the results. And that's cheap. A war like the one in Ukraine, that's something they don't want to repeat again. That's really expensive. But it seems it's effective because you can either conquer a population and go in there and have all the absorbed cost of trying to occupy them, or you just manipulate them so they vote against their own interest and vote to support Russia's interest. Just recently, the US government announced on New Year's Eve that there is clear evidence that both Russia and Iran have been involved in the US's past election and had tried to manipulate the outcomes. So this is something that we are seeing across the globe. Russia is incredibly active. And unfortunately, it seems that the United States is unwilling to confront it directly. There's sort of a fear, especially when we talk about things like disinformation, that it will be perceived as political, which is unfortunate given the fact that Russia is using this as a primary strategy, and we're doing little to talk about it. What do you think?
Well, of course, we're doing the show in English, and this market is English speakers in Europe and Ukraine and in the United States. And to people in the United States, I'd say, this isn't an academic issue. Russia has been able to elegantly affect the information climate in the United States so that a lot of people who are even pro-Ukraine, if you ask them how the war is going, they would say it's not going good for Ukraine. They've lost a lot of territory. That's a pro-Russian speaking point. Now, is that true? Well, Jason and I just talked about Russia lost 480,000 people in 1 year, and they didn't gain the size of Rhode Island. Their total gains this summer of winning, they gained 1% of the landmass of Ukraine. But most people, and I'm not slamming anyone, you would think quite the opposite. But that is how elegantly Russia can put its finger on the scales of the media coverage. There is another issue, and that there's a lot going on in the world. And I used to do a running tab slamming the BBC. You go to the front page of the Ukraine war in BBC World, and there are articles on there from last November. Their bandwidth for covering the war is quite small. Another Russian victory. Information about anything except how Russia is doing in Ukraine. And you and I hear it all the time. We're putting out information that no one else is putting out. You and I follow this very closely. It's our job. It's what we do. But I'm always amazed that this information doesn't gain wider traction. But I sit, honestly, Jason, and you and I have been doing this for many, many years, admiration of Russia's disinformation capabilities. They are first rate.
No, Russia treats it certainly as a science, how to control populations and manipulate them. We often talk about how the Russian population are like sheep. They just do whatever they're told. But that didn't just happen overnight. That was a long period of conditioning to get them into that position. And as much as we might laugh at the Russians, then we should also ask, why are people in the West voting for pro-Russian initiatives or politicians based upon what we know to be Russian disinformation or propaganda? It's sort of staggering when you think about it. Russia is much more effective than what I think many of us are able to acknowledge. And so it is at this point, urgently, that we need to get on top of this and have some sort of strategy to be combating it.
Yeah, it has been amazing, and it is, there is voluminous material. Jason and I may be some of the only guys, Jason reading it in its original, I read it in translation, but volumes of material from the KGB, from the FSB, not even highly classified documents. They lay out the plan of how to do this. You inject virulently opposing opinions into the news media. You play off the friction between those induced, introjected opinions, and you build schism into the program. Those were even the words of Che Guevara when he was discussing his press coverage of his insurrection in Bolivia. He told Castro to lean on the schisms. All he wanted people to do was fight about it. And that's what Russia still sticks to that. That was what, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. It still works. And the playbook is still in play.
That's absolutely the case. The fact is, Russia has been on this a long time, and they've studied it really well, and now they're applying it. Chuck, it was great talking to you today. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Jason. Great talking to you.